familiar with Professor Dr. Sergei Serebriany, but a few words about him before I invite him on stage to deliver his talk. Born in 1946, Dr. Sergei Serebriany is a senior Russian Indologist. In 1962-68, he studied Indian South Asian languages, including Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and Sanskrit at the Institute of Oriental Languages, now called the Institute of the Countries of Asia and Africa, Moscow State University. From 1972 to 1992, he worked as a research fellow at the Gorky Institute of World Literature in Moscow, conducting research on the history of Indian literature. In 1974, he completed his PhD thesis on the 15th century poet Vidyapati, earning the Candidate of Philology degree. Since 1992, he has been working at the Russian State University for the Humanities, directing the E.M. Meletinsky Institute for Advanced Studies since 2006. His research focuses on Indian literature, philosophy, and cultural history. He has published books and scholarly papers in Russian, English, French, and Hindi across multiple countries, and has translated works from English, Hindi, Bengali, and Sanskrit. We're very happy to have him here with us today to present his talk on the Mahabharata and Ramayana as a soft power of Indian culture.
Добрый день всем. Мне было сказано, что рабочий язык конференции английский, поэтому я приготовил текст на английском языке. Ну уж, тогда я его зачитаю. Надеюсь, мой английский будет достаточно понятен. Так что после разных вариантов индийского английского вы теперь будете слушать русский английский. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, no doubt, belong to the most widely known phenomena of Indian culture. The title of our conference, ending with the words, their universal influence, implies that the Mahabharata and Ramayana do have, or at least should have, a worldwide fame and a worldwide influence on humanity. Indeed, we may recall, for instance, how the British theatre and film director Peter Brook, together with the French author, in the 1980s, turned the main plot of the Mahabharata first into a long play and later into a shorter movie. Nearer to home, we may recall how several years ago, Indian TV series Mahabharata and Ramayana were avidly watched by people in Russia. But these and similar events, striking and memorable as they are, still are rather rare and far between, and not as non-problematic as they may seem. Moreover, this worldwide expansion of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, still rather limited as it is, has been a recent phenomenon, not more than 2.5 centuries old. Now, by the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, we live in the world in which various lands and various peoples become more and more interconnected. But for many centuries and even millennia, mankind had lived as communities of various sizes. Now historians call them cultures or civilizations. And these communities were separated from each other by big distances and big differences in their ways of life. Nevertheless, historians tell us that those cultures and civilizations may have had contacts and exchanges even in very ancient periods, and that with time those contacts and exchanges developed, even if not so spectacularly as in our days. And we may distinguish between migrations of material things and techniques on the one hand, and migrations of non-material things on the other hand. At the beginning of the 17th century, Francis Bacon, who is considered one of the initiators of modern European philosophy, wrote, and I quote, "Printing, gunpowder, and the compass have changed the whole face and state of things throughout the world." Now to this list of 3 items, they add the invention of paper, and the Chinese proudly call them the 4 great inventions. As far as I know, the art of papermaking did indeed migrate from China to Europe and then to the rest of the world. Gunpowder and compass seem to have been invented in China earlier than elsewhere, but a bit later they may have been invented in Europe independently. The case of printing is probably the most difficult one. There is no doubt that the modern history of printing by movable types began in Germany in the 15th century, but historians admit that Gutenberg might have known about a similar printing technique in Korea and probably even in China. In the internet, there is a long list of Indian inventions and discoveries, but I would like to emphasize here only the 3 non-material ones. First, the play of chess, and 2 inventions in the field of mathematics, the idea and the sign or symbol for 0, and the decimal place value numeral system. Without the latter 2, as far as I understand, the development of modern mathematics would have been impossible. The diffusion of the inventions like this must not have met serious obstacles. A different story is the diffusion of ideas, especially of those which belong to the sphere which we now call by the Latin word religion. Let us consider the 3 religions which in Russia are usually called мировые религии, world religions: Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. The teachings of these 3 religions are addressed to all humans. Unlike Hinduism, to which one has to be born, theoretically anyone may be converted to Buddhism and or Christianity and or Islam and become a Buddhist, a Christian, or a Muslim. But in the real world, all these 3 world religions could spread, could appeal to masses of people only within certain geographical limits each. Buddhism, originating in South Asia, we may now say in India, was superseded there by other faiths, but triumphed in Southeast and Eastern Asia, and until recently could not impress, say, Europe and, well, America. Christianity, originating in Western Asia, was later more successful in Europe, including Russia and Americas, but much less successful in Southeast, East, and Eastern Asia, as Islam, as well, has had its geographical limitations. The story of the Mahabharata and Ramayana is more like the story of the 3 world religions than that of gunpowder or book printing. Because, I suppose, both poems have been closely connected with another religious world, which Europeans have named Hinduism. Indeed, up to the 18th century, the plots and characters of the Mahabharata and Ramayana had hardly crossed the borders of Asia, being familiar to various peoples in Southeast Asia and even to an extent in Central Asia, Tibet and Mongolia, but remaining unknown to people in Europe and Western Asia. Even in China, the reception of the 2 Indian poems was, till rather recently, quite selective. The Mahabharata was hardly known. There were some echoes of the Ramayana in Chinese literary compositions, but mostly, if not exclusively, through the mediation of Buddhist texts. A very special place in the history of the Mahabharata and Ramayana belongs to the translations into Farsi, commissioned in the 16th century by the great Mughal Emperor Akbar. The translation of the Mahabharata was titled Raznama, Book of War. I have not been able to ascertain whether or not there were other translations of the Mahabharata into Farsi, but the Ramayana was translated into Farsi several times up to the late 19th century. There are more than one translations of the Mahabharata and Ramayana into Urdu as well. The distinguished British Indologist Professor Basham wrote in 1967, and I quote, "Although in the days of the Mughals, Persian paraphrases of both epics were made, the Muslim tradition of India and Pakistan seems to have rejected the ancient legends in their entirety," unquote. But it looks like Professor Basham was mistaken, and the matter deserves a more detailed study. As for translations into European languages, a breakthrough took place by the end of the 18th century. This breakthrough was a result of the historical process, which may be for short called the expansion of Europe. This expansion has been twofold: spatial or geographical, and intellectual or mental. It is well known that since the 15th century, Europeans began what they somewhat egocentrically called the age of discovery, or the age of exploration. In Russian, this label sounds even more pompously: эпоха великих географических открытий. Western Europeans crossed oceans and settled in other continents and/or established their power over local peoples. Russians, Eastern Europeans, crossed the Eurasian mainland, reached the Pacific Ocean, and later established their power over some peoples in Central Asia. The spatial expansion of Europe was closely connected with the intellectual expansion. The 15th and 16th century are marked by the Renaissance. The 16th and 17th century is the time of scientific revolution. The 17th and 18th century are called the age of enlightenment. It was in the 18th century that Russia joined this all-European development. One of the features of the Enlightenment was the interest in exotic, non-European cultures. By the end of the 18th century, some functionaries of the British colonial administration in India, inspired by the ideas of Enlightenment, started in earnest the investigation of Indian culture. Among other things, they discovered for themselves Sanskrit and many texts in this language. Their scholarly and artistic works, published in Calcutta, quickly reached Europe and stimulated the development of Indian and linguistic studies there, not only in Britain, but also, and very much so, in Germany, France, and other European countries, including Russia. The first Indian text translated in Calcutta about 1785, straight from Sanskrit into a European language, English, is said to be the Bhagavad Gita, an episode of the Mahabharata. In the following years, this translation was translated into several other European languages, including Russian, as early as 1788. In 1789, the year of the French Revolution, William Jones published in Calcutta his translation of Kalidasa's play Abhijnana Shakuntalam, based on another episode of the Mahabharata. This translation delighted Goethe in Germany, Karamzin in Russia, and other European men of letters. So we may say that the Mahabharata played a very important role in the initial acquaintance of Europeans with Indian literature and high culture in general. The role of the Ramayana was not less important. The Sanskrit text of Valmiki's Ramayana was first printed in 1806 by Baptist missionaries in Serampur, near Calcutta, and soon reached Europe. The German author Friedrich Schlegel, in his famous epoch-making book on the language and wisdom of Indians, published in 1808, included fragments of Valmiki Ramayana in his German translation. His elder brother, August Wilhelm Schlegel, published in 1823 a Latin translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and in 1829 a Latin translation of the first two books of Valmiki Ramayana. Unfortunately, he did not go on with this work. But after such a promising beginning, Mahabharata and Ramayana studies in Europe did not go on as brilliantly. It seems that Western Indologists in the 19th and 20th centuries were more attracted to Vedic and classical Sanskrit literature than to the two epics. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, as far as I know, did not exert much influence on European literature and culture as a whole. I may be mistaken, so let those who know better correct me. In the 19th and 20th centuries, several translations of both epics into English were produced in India by Indians. There are at least 2 or 3 translations of both into French. As early in 1860s as the 1860s, an Italian translation of Valmiki Ramayana was published in France. In the 20th century, American Indologists first undertook an English translation of the Mahabharata and later an English translation of Valmiki Ramayana, just recently completed. Both translations are in prose, very scholarly, with many detailed comments, but it is difficult to say what will be the influence of these very impressive academic undertakings on the Western culture in general. The same may be said about various translations into European languages of other Ramayanas, Tulsidasa's Ramayana in Avadhi, Kamad Ramayana in Tamil, and so on. The late Professor Besham, whom I have already mentioned and quoted, wrote in 1967, and I quote, "It is unfortunate that so far little has been done to introduce the Indian epics to the contemporary non-Indian reader. For, though full translations of both exist in English and several other European languages, none of these has been made in a style which conveys to the 20th century reader the forceful narrative of the Mahabharata or the subtle dialogue and fine descriptive writing of the Ramayana. Good abridged translations of both poems in modern idiom are indeed to bring something of their grandeur and beauty to a wider circle of readers in the lands where their stories are not traditionally known." Unquote. I am afraid that these sad words are still topical today. In any case, they are quite topical for the situation in Russia today. Indian studies imported to Russia from Western Europe by the end of the 18th century developed rather slowly and with some difficulties almost through the 19th century. There were few scholars of Sanskrit at some universities. Those scholars duly published translations of Nala and Damayanti, the story of Savitri, and other texts from the Mahabharata for the use of students. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the predominant interest of Indologists in Russia proved to be directed towards Buddhism and various Buddhist texts rather than towards Hindu epics. In Russia's high culture in general, the Mahabharata and Ramayana occupied a very limited space. The majority of educated Russians looked more to the West than to the East in general. Russians are justly proud of their classical literature, roughly from Vasily Zhukovsky and Alexander Pushkin up to Lev Tolstoy and Anton Chekhov. But the authors of this golden age of Russian letters were very little attracted to India and the world outside the West in general. Lev Tolstoy indeed was a kind of exception, but he developed an interest in non-European cultures rather late in his life and could not possibly get an adequate knowledge about those cultures. India he knew rather little and understood even less. He knew very little about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. In his library in Yasnaya Polyana, there is preserved a French translation of the Ramayana, of Valmiki's Ramayana, but it is not clear whether or not he ever read it. Among the large number of the first-rate literary works created by Russian authors up to the beginning of the 20th century, there is only one that may be called a translation from an Indian language, Sanskrit, of course. It is a poem Nal and Damayanti by Vasily Zhukovsky, first published in 1844 and many times reprinted later. This poem is justly considered a minor masterpiece of Russian poetry, the only one of its kind. But strictly speaking, it is not first a translation, but a free retelling of the Mahabharata story, and secondly, not from Sanskrit. Zhukovsky did not know Sanskrit and based his poem on a free rendering of this story in German by the German poet Friedrich Rückert. After 1917, Indian studies in Russia suffered many hardships and many losses, just like the country as a whole. Study of Sanskrit and other Indian languages was precariously preserved in the city then called Leningrad, and even to a lesser degree in Moscow. Alexei Petrovich Barannikov, who graduated from Kiev University in 1914, more or less successfully adjusted himself to the post-1917 realities and is remembered as the initiator in Russia, in Leningrad, of the study of new Indian languages. He knew Sanskrit, of course, as well. During World War II, he lived in the evacuation in Kazakhstan and translated there Tulsidasa's Ramayana into Russian rhymed verses. The huge book with a long introduction and detailed commentaries was published in Moscow in 1948. Barannikov proved to be a kind of Rama Bhakta, but unlike Tulsidas, he was not a poet, and his translation is hardly readable, though the learned commentaries are very valuable. The book as a whole has become a paradoxical monument to the time when it was produced. Also in Leningrad, and about the same time, there appeared a Russian prose translation of the first Parva, Adi Parva, of the Mahabharata. The translator was Vladimir Ivanovich Kalyanov, Barannikov's pupil. His translation of the Adi Parva appeared in 1950. His translation of the second book, the Sabha Parva, was published in 1962. Later, he translated 4 more books of the Mahabharata. Other books were translated by other scholars in Leningrad, later again called St. Petersburg. As far as I know, the project as a whole has just been completed. It has been a formidable work. Now it remains to be seen what influence this high-class academic translation will have on our culture in general. The first Russian translation of Valmiki's Ramayana was started in Moscow at the very beginning of this century by our senior colleague, the late Pavel Alexandrovich Grintsev. Unfortunately, Pavel Alexandrovich could himself published only the translations of the first two books of Valmiki Ramayana. His translation of the third book was published posthumously. His unfinished translation of the fourth book may be completed and published sooner or later. And this work is continuing. Today we'll listen to a paper about this project. Pavel Alexandrovich has offered a new way of translating Sanskrit shlokas into Russian. It was a very important breakthrough in the ways of translating Sanskrit poems. This kind of translation may be more appealing to Russian readers, but so far the feedback from readers is insufficient. Well, I think I have reached the limit of my time. I could tell more about translations that have been printed, but what I want to say, to improve the situation with the translation work of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, we have to develop the study and the teaching of Sanskrit in this country. Unfortunately, as far as I know, the teaching of Sanskrit is not too widely spread now, even in Moscow. It goes on in St. Petersburg to an extent. But so far, actually, there are practically no people who can translate poetry straight from Sanskrit into Russian poetry. You can't teach people write poetry, actually. Poets are born as poets. And maybe if many people learn Sanskrit one way or another, sometimes there will appear talented translators who would translate Sanskrit poetry, including the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And apart from anything else, these two monuments, they are high-class poetry. So we have to wait till new generations of Russians who learn Sanskrit probably will try and produce, poetic translations of both epics. Well, as they say in India, iti. That's what I wanted to say. Sorry if I detained you too much.